really what a great pleasure to be in such a multilingual environment. Ça fait plaisir aussi avec les francophones. Excellent, ça fait plaisir d'être avec vous. Pero mi primer amor era de español. Entonces, hispanoparlantes también. Excelente. I'm sorry that I cannot do that in Chinese. I regret. But it is such a pleasure to be with language teachers. I love language teachers. We have a special power, a kind of magic power. Language teachers do. And I'd like to talk about that magic power that we have. A language, teaching a language is different than teaching any other subject. Because language learning changes us. It has a kind of transformative power. I was talking to a student, came to me, said, a foreigner on the platform came to me. They said, "Do you speak English?" I said, "A little." They asked me directions. I could tell them. It was fun. That student, because of that experience, decided to go to Australia for a summer. Then decided to stay for a year. And came back speaking English, telling me these stories of their life in Australia. This changed their life. And imagine this one experience on the platform was a trigger. Something changed. That's magic. That's power. And now, when we're a beginner, it doesn't feel like so. This is how we feel when we're a beginner, right? But we know, you know, this transformation is possible. I ask my students at the beginning of the semester, I draw a circle, I tell them, draw a circle. This is you. Now, where is English? And sometimes they put it way out here, and they tell this tragic story, a story of true suffering, and it is true suffering if you struggle with a language. Sometimes they tell the story that we can see them reaching out. Sometimes they tell a story of language being a seed which grows inside of you. And as it grows inside of you, of course, you change. You are transformed. So today I'd like to talk about what makes language learning transformational, and how can we make our teaching more transformational. Now, I think that one way to think about this is that language learning is transformational because we learn a foreign way of being ourselves. We are still ourselves, but we are ourselves in a foreign way. We are still playing the music, but we've changed instruments. And when you change instruments, the music is different, but you are still making the music. We're not trying to become a foreigner. We're trying to be ourselves in a new way. But this is how I experience language learning, but I have a frustration. And this frustration is that if language learning is so cultural, because we have these foreign cultural experiences, we transform ourselves. If it is so cultural, why is it so hard to bring culture into the classroom? We have this dilemma as language teachers. We know that language and culture are closely related, as Aoki Sensei said, cannot separate. Yet, in the classroom, they're often separate. They're separate in the study of linguistics and anthropology. They're separate in the study of second language acquisition and intercultural communication. As language teachers, how do we bring these together? So I've thought about this, and when I talk to teachers about this question, this is you on your way to class, too much to do, and what are you doing? Well, you're a language teacher. You have these things to do, and someone says, okay, also culture. And you say, how? How can I possibly add something to all of this? This is the typical way to think about culture and language education. And this is true even among specialists. If you study second language acquisition, they call it second language acquisition. Acquisition, something you get, something you take, put it in your mind. But if you study intercultural communication or anthropology, they talk about awareness. Let's have intercultural awareness. Well, so here we have this concrete knowledge and skills, and here we have this kind of abstract awareness of culture. So this creates a kind of competing framework. Well, today, should I do language, skills and knowledge, or culture, awareness? Well, this is impossible. We have such limited time and so much to do. So this traps us, this way of thinking. And we can see this in typical goals of language learning is about knowledge and skills, and cultural learning is about awareness. This has bothered me for a long time. So I'd like to talk to you about my thinking for my teaching about how to go beyond this dilemma. And for me, I think of this in terms of deep learning. And the basic idea is that on the surface of studying, language and culture are separate. But at the deeper level of mind, language and culture are very closely related. And if we are doing deep language learning, we are also doing cultural learning at the same time. And this is the idea I'd like to explore a little bit. Now you notice that my title had Embodied Perspective. And the first thing I'd like to say is that deep learning is embodied. And by embodied, I mean that we're now understanding through the study of cognition that language and culture are not just ideas or symbols or concepts. Language and culture are embodied. They are complex, embodied networks of meaning that are connected to our feelings and body and unconscious and intuition. And to give you a feeling for this, I'd like to spend we're going to take a 5-minute a 5-minute lesson in neurolinguistics. Isn't that cool? This is not just feel-good kind of thing. We're going to look at the brain. Do I have sound here? I hope I have sound here. Okay. Can we get the lights, please?
This is a map of someone's brain, showing roughly which areas respond when they hear different words. For example, there's a small area in the middle frontal gyrus that reliably responds to hearing the word top. But it's not just one word, one location. A single word can activate a whole range of different brain regions. So we find the word top in a bit of brain that seems to respond to words associated with clothing and appearances. But also here with numbers and measurements. And here with buildings and places. We usually think of language as being restricted to certain sections, like the temporal lobe. So researchers were surprised to find activity all across the brain and in both hemispheres. The map was made by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley. They put volunteers in an MRI scan and had them listen to stories for 2 hours.
Back to the front again, deep, deep, and she pulled out a pack of matches that had been laundered at least once.
By monitoring blood flow to different parts of the brain, they worked out which places were responding to the meaning of the words, the semantics. They found that different bits of the brain responded to different kinds of words and concepts. And they could group them into rough categories, shown here by the different colours. Dark green bits, for example, were most activated by words to do with numbers, red bits by social words. Here, in the right temporoparietal junction, this speck of brain, just a few millimetres across, was found to respond to words like wife, mother, pregnant, and family. And this bit just next door responds to some of the same social words like family and wife, but also words to do with places and people like house and owner. Generally, the concepts represented in each brain region relate to other functions that scientists already know about. So words to do with how things look, such as stripes, are likely to be found near the visual cortex. And although each individual's map is different, looking at these 3 brains, it's clear that different people have the same kinds of concepts in the same kinds of places. This is the first time we've been able to map the semantic systems of the brain in such detail, discovering that words are grouped by meaning, and revealing just how complicated and widespread the word maps in our heads really are. And the brain map is available online for anyone to explore.
Next to you, what stands out for you when you watch this? What did you notice about this? What does this mean for us as language teachers? Well, just what did you notice? What was interesting for you? And then how can this help us as language teachers? Say hello, be friendly, make community. Zero. I have to use my teacher's voice. 0. Okay, let's come back. Isn't this interesting? Isn't this amazing? It's so different than the kind of simple image we have. And it's also very different from this image that there's a kind of language place in the brain, or a module, the L2, the acquisition device, for example. So let's just what can we get from this? Just what did you discuss? Just mention a couple of things that you discussed. Oh, by the way, I've been living in Japan a long time. I am very comfortable with silence. I can wait.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is interesting, though maybe I'm not taking the right path on that, but what about, what I was seeing that, I was thinking like, what about the cultural background? Like, because, okay, we say one word, the example, like word top, so like we say this word like, okay, it goes in many places in the brain, maybe it could be the same for many people, but then what about the cultural background? So like we were talking about the gender, so, but again, gender thing is also a question of cultural background. So according to the experience of the person, her or his cultural background, like, does it take the same path? Does it take the same interpretation? And also, like, it's one word, say, it's one word as a content, but what about the, you know, in the communication, like, you know, the percentage, I don't know how accurate it is actually, like, I learned that like in school, but like 25% is the content, another 25% is the way we say it, and 50% is the non-verbal communication. So this is what I was thinking. And then, yeah.
That's a great question. So I think the word that you said was experience, based on the person's experience,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, instead of saying cultural background, I would say experience.
So culture is shared experience. When a community has shared experience, they have a shared understanding, and that shared understanding generates what we call culture. Shared expectations, shared understanding. So I think one of the things we see from this is that language is experiential. The word top is not in one place. The word top is in different places depending on the situation in which it's used. So this network of language is completely connected to experience. And that experience is connected, is where culture, is the culture connection. Culture is shared experience. But I don't want to go too far. I want to get some other reactions. So let's keep this word experience in mind, okay? And then let's just get a couple of other points that come to mind when you saw this.
Before I just jump into the comment that we discussed here, just one clarification. Was it the English language that the main language was used in?
This was done in English, yes. And I don't know of any research in other languages for this particular. And I was also asked, this was an L1, this was a quote-unquote native speaker. So, and I don't know what this would be like for an L2 speaker. Yeah.
One thing that we discussed in our small team here was that also the puzzle. What happens if you have different languages used in this experiment, like Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Russian, where we also have the culture coming and different words that mean different things to different culture, depending on where you come from. So we were thinking how this would change this experiment, because the core here is that although all people are different, it turns out that in terms of semantics, we have same zones in the brain signaling or responding in the same way, which we found interesting. So the word that comes to my mind is diversity, maybe. We have to also look at the diversity thing. It's not just, you just pick up one group and you assume that everybody else has the same receptors and the same reactions. We have to really be careful about, we have to first identify the groups and the cultural backgrounds they come from, and then maybe develop strategies, etc.
Thank you. You talked about different zones. Did you notice what the zones were? They had a little pie graph. Now there was, do you remember any of the zones? There was social, there was numbers, there was places, there was visual, there was feeling. Those are experiential categories, not conceptual categories. Those are related to how the body and mind experiences the physical world and the social world. So the lesson from those categories is, it was not organized by verbs and nouns. It was organized by categories of experience. And social experience is cultural. So one of the words was hard for me to learn in Japanese was nakama. Also, the word yoroshiku is also very difficult at the beginning. Yoroshiku. How do you translate yoroshiku? Well, why is yoroshiku hard to translate? Because yoroshiku must be learned in the context of Japanese interaction. You have to experience yoroshiku in the Japanese social context. So language learning is experiential. Cultural learning is experiential. I could learn yoroshiku by experiencing yoroshiku. And we can see that in the brain categories, that it's categorizing by experience. So this is very interesting as well. And it's an interesting question how this would look for a non-native speaker. There is L1, L2 research about processing, but I haven't seen this particular. Let's take one more. She was first, sorry. Well, you can both.
Very short. We were impressed about the colors and the fact that these colors were connecting and mixing, and the same word was becoming like red or blue or purple. And these sections, these surfaces, were more or less the same for the other people. And so we were maybe talking about the fact that the brain is maybe, the way it reacts is maybe the same as an arm or a leg or something for human beings. So as teachers, maybe we maybe try to find the connections that people have in class, because they have the same way of reacting as everybody. Okay, shortly, but we kind of...
Excellent, yes. And you know, when we say that language is embodied, it really is embodied. Now, when you speak on your cell phone, you bump into things. Because the function, the brain function of processing language is the same as perceiving the world. That's why you can't notice things when you're speaking on the phone. Because perceiving, looking at something, and processing the language looking at something uses the same mental processes. Language is experiential. You had...
One is abstract concepts as opposed to physical objects. Because language, when you say words, it's just way too broad, right? Words. So concepts, where are concepts located there? And is it just...
So I took out my slides about that. If you're interested in that, I suggest you look up embodied simulation theory. This is a neuro-linguistic research about how the brain produces meaning. And the idea is that conceptual thinking is metaphoric. So they did research where they showed a happy face, and they said to people, is this person feeling joy or happiness? When they asked people in a bar, they were more likely to say joy. When they asked them in a library, they were more likely to say happiness. Because joy is a liquid metaphor. You're full of joy. Happiness is an object metaphor. You have happiness. You get happiness. So within the word joy and happiness, there is a metaphorical understanding that is embodied. So concepts are metaphorical is one answer to that. But I don't think...
That's true to English.
Well, so this is, I mean, I'm familiar with the research in English, but that line of reasoning, they don't know. They don't know, of course. What is a concept? How are concepts created in the brain? The study of semantics is very complex. So there's no easy answer. But we know it's not just a bunch of labels in our mind. It's more complex than that. And it's more embodied than that. And it's also highly metaphoric. So that's you might look for, that research is looking specifically at that. I'm feeling like we should go ahead. Can we move forward a little bit? So I'll tell you what I get when I see this. What I get is, this helps me, in my mind, to understand the connection between language and culture. That the forms of language it's a system of meaning, of course, a dynamic, complex system of meaning, and that system of meaning is based in our experience, and our understanding of language is largely intuitive, not conceptual. We have a feeling for language. We talk about native intuition. That we need to distinguish between this explicit conceptual understanding and this deeper, more intuitive level of understanding. And that on the surface, language and culture may be very separate, but down here, in our intuitive understanding of language, how do I understand yoroshiku? How do I get this intuitive feeling for yoroshiku? That comes from my experience, and that experience is grounded in cultural community. So we have a shared cultural community. I experience this. I have an intuitive understanding, and that is connected to this linguistic system of meaning, which then I can analyze here if I'm a linguist. But the experience is down here. This is how I have started to think about this connection between language and culture. So that as a language teacher, what I want to say is I want to go deeper. I want my students' learning to be deeper, more intuitive, more experiential, more problem solving, more trial and error, more experimentation, more physical. And this idea of going deeper is what I talk about, is what I refer to as deep learning. So I've been experimenting or thinking about this idea of deep learning and what deep learning is. And another point that I get from this brain video is that language learning is complex, that this network in the brain is extremely complex. And complex does not mean complicated. Not complicated, complex. Complex means many parts interact. Many parts interact and it creates a bigger pattern. So a flock of birds, each bird has very simple programming. But when you put them together, it creates complex patterns. Language is complex. This network is complex. It's more than the sum of its parts. So language must be... So we are not just adding language to a fixed system. We are changing the system or creating a new system. So we need to think of deep learning is complex. We know this because just learning the vocabulary words does not mean you can speak. Just understanding the grammar rules does not mean that it all comes together. But sometimes you have the student where there's this magic moment where things come together. And suddenly the speaking improves, or suddenly they're speaking, or suddenly they're forgetting grammar and they're just speaking. That's when we are getting this deeper, complex learning. So if you ask me to draw a picture of language learning that I have in my mind, this is kind of the picture that I get in my mind. So there's the language and culture tree, which is very complex, and we've got to get it here. And this is painful, takes a lot of effort. Okay, so here's your next critical thinking question. There's a line here. What is this line? Why do we have this? So ask your new friend or your old friend, what is this? What are these two things here? So, what's up here? Prefrontal cortex. conscious. Okay, so this is more conscious, and this is more intuitive or unconscious. Yeah, so if the technical word, if you're interested in the technical words, this is studied under the idea of dual processing models of cognition. There are different terms that are used, most typical conscious or unconscious, but this can also be reflective versus intuitive or attentive mind. Sometimes the narrative conscious versus the cognitive unconscious. The words that I use for me, I use the attentive mind and the intuitive mind. And I say attentive because this is the mind that pays attention. This is the mind that is analyzing or thinking conceptually. So if I say, okay, get ready, 2 plus 4 plus 3 equals. Okay, so when you did that, you had these numbers in your mind and you kind of hold them there and you wait for the next one and then you add it. That's this attentive mind. When you're riding your bicycle, but you're thinking about dinner and you're imagining what you have to get at the store to make sukiyaki, that's imagining, planning, conscious thought, analysis, the string of thoughts. The driving is going on here. The bicycle riding is down here. Whereas language, well, language is here, of course. When we're using language, we have an intuitive mind which is managing language. So it's very complex what's going on here. It's not simple. It's not just feelings. It's not just Freud. It's very complex. And then I think of reflection as being connecting this more conscious part of our mind to the intuitive part of our mind, making connections between these two. So this reminds me that deep learning is intuitive. It requires experimentation, experience, trial and error. This is how these intuitive learning processes take place. Now, of course, for a language, we need both. We need to study, but we also need to get to internalize, to get a feel, to make these connections. So if we think about this surface and deep, attentive and intuitive, it changes the language, culture, education picture. Remember, we had skills, we had knowledge, skills, and awareness. So if we add depth to this, then we get a very different triangle. So we have this knowledge, skills, and awareness. Is that an earthquake?
Yes. Oh my, yes.
Oh, I can see the water shaking.
Yes. It's very strong.
In accord with Mother Nature.
Yeah. It really resonated.
Because we are talking about that.
Yeah, we're doing deep. The earth melted. The earth melted. So I guess are we okay? Okay. So remember our skills, our knowledge, skills, and awareness, right? But if we think about this in surface and deep, this gives us a very different picture. Because skills can be simple, and we can explain them, but complex skills would give us a sense of mastery. So deep, skilled knowledge is mastery. When we have complex knowledge, the deeper it goes, the more it's intuitive knowledge. So this is book learning, and this is internalized intuitive knowledge. And this awareness, we can be aware of something at a surface level, but if we're aware at a deep level, it gives us insight, the ability to look deeper. So down here, if as language teachers, if our students are getting a feeling for language, they're learning to master language, they're getting insight into culture, These are all very closely connected. All of this deeper learning. So, this leaves us with just one problem. We've decided we want deep learning. Okay, deep learning sounds good, great metaphor. How do we do it? What is the process for going deeper? And for this, I've been learning a lot from Kurt Fischer, who studies how neural networks are created in the brain in developing, in adolescent development. It's called dynamic skill theory, Kurt Fischer. And dynamic skill theory talks about skills in terms of how the brain develops networks. And this has helped me understand that here we have more simple knowledge, more discrete knowledge, and this is more networked, more intuitive, more deeper knowledge. So the question for us as language teachers is, how do we go from here to here? How do we get this deeper intuitive understanding? So let's think about the student who's here. So the student who's here, actually my cousin. Let's think about my cousin. He said, I went to visit the United States and my cousin said, "Hey, Joe, you live in Japan, right?" "Yeah, I speak Japanese. Konnichiwa." And then he waited for me to praise him. But that's what beginning language learners are like. That is their understanding. Because for them, this is speaking Japanese. Konnichiwa. They got it. They know it. For my cousin, this is language learning. Because that's his level of development. So, Kurt Fischer has helped me see that the deeper the learning, that deeper learning changes our experience. So if we listen to how students are talking about learning, we can track their development. So for example, here are 4 students. And we ask them, what do you have to do to learn English? And this one said, well, to communicate better, I have to learn many words. I need to make perfect sentences. Mistakes prevent communication. I try not to worry about mistakes. Wait, this one says, don't make mistakes. This one says, don't worry about mistakes. This one says, I need to understand learning processes. What works for me? Okay, now use your teacher intuition. You have intuitive understanding from working with students. Which student, can you rank them from beginner to advanced? So with the person next to you, rank these 4 students. Let's call this A, B, C, and D. Yes. So who is the beginning learner and who is the more advanced learner? I'll ask you to vote. Still discussing. Okay, so we're going to do this. 1 is the lowest level student, 4 is the highest. So I'll point, and then you raise your hand with 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, so this student, is this student lowest, 2, 3, or 4? Ready, 1, 2, 3, go. So we have lots of 1s, a couple of 2s, we have a 4, many 1s. Okay, how about this one? Perfect sentences. The most common answer is 2. Okay, how about this one? Try not to worry about mistakes. We have 3s. 3 is the most common answer, some 4s. How about this one? We need to understand learning processes. We have 4s. Most common answer is 4. So if we were just to vote and get the most common answer, then we would get this. Yeah, so I need to learn words.
Yes.
That's, and now when I ask my students this, often they think this is the highest one. Because they think people who speak English know lots of words. And that says something about their level of learning. But after this, they need to start making these connections. Much of what we do as language teachers is help learners make connections. From sound to from hearing it to seeing it, from putting words together to form sentences, to getting whole meaning. So this is the kind of mapping, the learning, the structure. And then there's this jump where we get to this system level, where suddenly things come together, where things are working as a system. And at this level they say, well, I need to, don't worry about mistakes. So this is try to make perfect sentences. Don't worry about mistakes. And this is the very difficult boundary, right? You cannot force people to go here. But if we can help our students experience this, at least a little bit in their class, then they can learn to get here on their own. But if they have never experienced this, they will be stuck thinking that words are the most important thing. Now this system of systems means it's not just I learn this language, but I look at other languages also. I'm bridging, I'm extending this knowledge to other domains. That's what we are doing. This is what we are doing here. This is language learning. This is now you're a language teacher. So this has helped me in my teaching to see that what I'm trying to do is get my students to develop this deeper, more complex, more networked, more embodied knowledge. And you know what's cool is this works for culture too. Now I made this one up. My cousin didn't really say this. But you met people like this, right? Yeah, I was in Kyoto, man. So we can do the same thing. I'm going to jump ahead. Let's just look at this for a moment. We won't take the time to discuss, but think about which of these are more advanced, and which of them are simpler understanding of culture. So now, in your mind, if you kind of guess which one is which, and by the way, I can give you a copy of these PowerPoint slides, so I'm very happy to do that. Maybe my pleasure. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So check what you thought with the next slide, and then discuss with the next person. Was your guess, was it like you thought? Now, before I show you the slide, I want you already understand this. You have an intuitive feeling for which of these is more advanced, but you might not have a way to organize your intuition. So anyway, check your intuitive understanding. Okay. This has helped me a lot. This has helped me a lot to see that, you know, yeah, and people in Japan bow. That's a fact. And it's important. Maybe I've been there, I've seen that. That's a single experience. I've seen Kyoto. That's a single experience. But then, over time, you start to connect these single facts or these single experiences into something more complex, more like cause and effect, or when here, do that. So etiquette is more complex than a fact. If A, then B. And this is this kind of rule-based thinking. This is when you're trying to figure out the rules, the structure. But we know that culture is dynamic. You cannot reduce culture to rules. Wait. You cannot reduce language to rules either. Language is dynamic, culture is dynamic. Same sequence. When you start to learn the system, then you start to have a holistic view. Then you can step into this other view and say, okay, let's look at this from the Japanese perspective, from the French perspective, from the Canadian perspective, because we can see that it's a dynamic system. It's not just rules, it's a system. And now maybe I've learned about Japanese culture, and then I go to Peru, and I learn about Peruvian culture, and I start to see, and I start to make these more extended connections. This has helped me organize my thinking about culture and about how to create cultural learning activities. And it's also helped me see that we can put language and culture together into one learning progression. Discrete knowledge and facts, rules and structure, integration. And what's this? What are these 4 circles? That's how the learner feels. This is what it feels like. This is this process of embodying, of internalizing, of making it part of you, of transformation. This is the transformation. And the deeper the learning, the more complex the learning, the more embodied the learning, the more it's transformative. So this is why in my own teaching, what I'm thinking about is how can I make the learning deeper? How can I make it more complex? How can I make it more experiential, more embodied, more trial and error, more experimentational? Because this will bring the learners to this deeper intuitive knowledge. This thing here is called the developmental model of linguaculture learning. If you're interested in that, you can get an article. There will be a book coming out next year. But this is, for me, how I am now thinking about the power and the magic of what we're doing. That if we are not thinking so much about how much our students are learning, but how deep their learning is, then we are succeeding, and we can all find our own ways to make learning deeper and more embodied and more complex and more experiential and more engaging. And that will lead us to this transformational power and magic that makes what we do so important, and which, as Aoki Sensei said, can bring peace to the world. It requires deep learning to make these big changes. And that's why I love being with language teachers, because we're doing such difficult work, but such important work. And we shouldn't expect it to be easy, but that's because it's so powerful. And that's the magic and power. So thank you for spending time with me here today.
Joseph, we maybe have time for one question before we wrap up.
I carefully made it so that there was time for one question.
More a comment than a question. On the 4 levels you have, from the from the most discrete to the most abstract. When you said that the student that is, I need to know more words. Words are key, right? And if you know that, where their learning is. I think that's, in the context of Japanese language education, I think that reflects more the way, for example, English is taught, usually, in Japan, in the sense that in Japan, English education is obsessed with knowing a lot of vocabulary and having perfect grammar, because you need that to pass TOEIC, you need that to get into the university. So because that's the ideal, that's where they are. So I think it's more a reflection of the context where the student is.
I agree that Japanese language education focuses on this. And in fact, if you get lots of these, but not much of this, then you can get stuck. It's harder to make those connections if you have too much here. So you get kind of... So the idea is learn fewer items, fluency sooner. Right? Instead of 15 color words, learn 5 color words and apply them. And then this lets you get to these higher levels. But absolutely, Japanese language education, and not just Japan, but traditional language education is often based on this kind of thinking. Yeah, very much so. So I guess we had one question. We had time for one question. Bruno, tell me one question.
Yes.
And it's time. We need to take a break.
We need to take a break. Yes. So please give.
Just one last thing. These ideas are not just mine. They've been developed over a period of years at the Japan Intercultural Institute. We've had a series of workshops over a period of 5 or 6 years to develop these ideas. Val Hansford, for example, can you raise your hand, Val? She's a long-term GII person. We have a learning circle where we get together with teachers. Bruno's going to be a guest speaker at our learning circle in January. Hunter, you were our guest speaker in, was it December? Or no, in November, whenever it was. And Hana has been the organizer of the GII Learning Circle, so there's a lot of Japan Intercultural Institute energy in this room, and if you're interested in that, just give me your business card or your email address, and I will put you on the GII mailing list, and we'll give you information about the events that we're doing, or talk to Bruno, talk to Roxana is also involved, Val, Hana, Javier. So.
Can we actually make your PowerPoint into a PDF or something and make it available?
Oh, absolutely.
To the people, because we have your emails. So after this conference, we will contact you and we will give you a link to Joseph's PowerPoint or PDF. And then maybe you have your information there also, and people can contact you.
Of course, yeah. And my email address is on the PDF. And I can also give you my business card. But if you're to make sure you get on the mailing list, just give me your business card, or just write your email address down on something, and then I'll put you on the GII mailing list. Okay, thank you so much for spending this time. Enjoy the conference.